Um, so hi everyone. Welcome to I guess the first Tech for Social Goods series of talks featured by BfE Technology. And today we are very fortunate to have Wendi, who is our Global Software Development Manager, to give us a short sharing on accessibility in software development. And Wendi, the floor is yours.
Cool. Thanks, Kevin. So as you can see, I'm talking about accessibility in software development. I'm mostly going to talk about 4 things. One, what is accessibility? Why is this important? Who benefits from this? And how do we go about doing this? So first, what is accessibility? The concept of web accessibility allows people to consume, understand, navigate, and contribute to the web. There are a number of reasons that will affect web access. The ones that probably come to mind the most are things like visual, auditory, physical, and cognitive disabilities. So how about we consider some of the following examples? So these are just some screen grabs from UK websites. People will probably be quite familiar with BBC News. So this kind of thing is very easy to understand for most of us. Looking at this now, you can see the different news articles, there's pictures, there's prominent titles. It's pretty easy to navigate and quite intuitive. However, consider a user using a screen reader due to visual impairment. How would their screen reader relay the contents of this website to them in a sensibly structured manner? Or if a user is unable to use a mouse due to a motor disability, how are they going to be able to navigate through a website using just a keyboard? Now, when you start to think about these things, the layout of this website and how you would navigate this and understand the content is a lot less obvious. So I think that is a quick demonstration of why something like accessibility is important. But to further on this point, as a society, we're becoming more reliant on the web. This has made its way into many essential parts of life, especially now. But for example, education, government, healthcare, and many more things. To give everyone the same opportunities, it's really important that websites are accessible to everyone. It can be pretty easy to forget this when developing a website. So I'll give you an example of a website with relatively poor accessibility. So you can see on the left here that they have an accessibility score of 57. And this is according to Lighthouse, which is something I'll briefly touch on later. And here is the output from Lighthouse about some of the things that it fails for accessibility. Here we can see that the page doesn't contain a heading, a skip link, landmark region. Don't worry, I'm not sure what that is either. But the reason that this is fails the accessibility test is that for someone who needs to use something like a screen reader or their keyboard, they will have to keep navigating lots and lots of things to be able to get to what they want. And there is not a clear indication of what everything on the web page is. Another factor is contrast. So if you go onto the Hacker News website, I think this is quite similar to Reddit actually. You have these numbers, but these are in like a light grayish color. And for people with something like color blindness, this will be pretty hard to read or understand what is going on there. So we can take this idea even further. For many people with disabilities, an accessible web can offer access to information and interactions that would be impossible to get through traditional methods, such as books or radio or newspaper. So here I've given you an example of a website with poor accessibility. Now let's go for something in the complete opposite. So this is the government website, gov.uk. If you're looking for examples of good web accessibility, they are probably one of the best examples out there. They have to make sure that their website is accessible to everyone in the UK for whatever they need it for. So as you can see here, Lighthouse gives them an accessibility score of 100. And obviously I can't show you the errors that or issues that it has. So here we can see some of the really important things that people with any kinds of disabilities or accessibility issues may need to access their website for. Very relevant now. Everyone needs to be able to keep up to date with coronavirus updates, how to get COVID app, and as you can see, a bunch of really important things about how people can do things. If the government website wasn't accessible or was a lot less accessible than, you know, for blind people or other kinds of disabled people, they wouldn't be able to do this from their own home. They would have to call people up or go there in person, which again means that the ease of access is very different for different people. Alongside inclusivity, there are other benefits of web accessibility, including SEO, which is search engine optimization, which you can also see in this Lighthouse score. Search engines access your website in a similar way to people who are visually impaired. So actually by improving your website, you also improve SEO, which is very important nowadays and a big thing for a lot of websites. Furthermore, it's a matter of reputation. Demonstrating social responsibility will help build public relationships, and users will more likely use and recommend your site. Furthermore, usability for all users is very important, because whilst working on accessibility, it is likely you'll discover other usability issues with your website that would affect all users. I think there was a recent example where Kevin or someone used iOS as dark mode and discovered something that actually was difficult to think about at the time, but would affect a big portion of the users who would access BfE newsletters. So who benefits from this? In short, everyone. Although most of the considerations are for people with disabilities, it extends to a far greater set of people beyond just that demographic. I'll talk about a few easy to digest examples related to a few big common errors or issues. So blindness. One section of blindness is color blindness. And a colorblind user may be using the site without any special tools, but may struggle to distinguish between many different colors. This is particularly important for applications with extensive images, such as charts and color pickers. So an important thing is to ensure that any color-sensitive images or elements include a label. So if you look at this example here, without labels, the selector for a t-shirt color would be nearly unusable for a user with protanopia, which is one type of color blindness. So on the left is what a normal user would see, and on the right is what a user with a certain kind of color blindness would see. And this is something that you can generate using a tool. I will talk about some sorts of tools that you can use later on. Other things that fall into this category are things like partial blindness. Partially sighted users may still be able to use a site without a screen reader, but may require increased font sizes or contrast. And many users that are not necessarily considered disabled can be included here. There are rapidly more and more aging internet users who often have mildly impaired eyesight. And now a step further is complete blindness. So some users will not be able to see the screen at all and will rely entirely on a screen reader. So a screen reader is something that essentially goes through your entire web page or screen and reads out everything that it sees, quote unquote sees. The screen reader works its way through the HTML on your page and reads the text aloud. However, when it comes to an image, there's a thing called the alt text of an image. This is where we can put some information about the image for the screen reader to read out. So actually this became relevant on one of my recent projects at my company. So we had a client called the British Library, which again, for anyone in the UK or otherwise may be familiar with, they were developing a part of their website where users or authors with books could access some data about how often their books are loaned and how popular they are. So what you can see on the top right here is charts. So charts and graphs are very useful and good as a way to communicate data in a comprehensible way. And as you can see, we have different labels, which was also necessary to run through color blindness requirements, which was actually, in fact, a really long and difficult process because 10 colors in 9 different kinds of color blindness is really difficult to find. But another thing about this is that even though charts are very visually accessible, they are not very accessible for screen readers because they will just kind of read out the numbers in sequence without any context. So you can see on the bottom left here, this is a short snippet of code that I wrote whilst working on accessibility, which essentially turns all of the series data of the graph into sentences. So you can kind of see at the end, even if you don't really understand code, return loan data for book with title blah and ISBN blah, 1 loan or X loans from some years. So yeah, you know, when you're thinking about having cool visuals and infographics, it's also important to think about users who cannot access this data and if they can understand this and whether this is something that they need to also be able to have access to. There's also similar resources like on video elements, they have a label to give a transcript, but often if you see a lot of websites, they have an additional transcript on the website. A good example is something like Khan Academy or a lot of these modern like course learning websites. All right, so this is just a quick infographic on some do's and don'ts for designing for accessibility, but I'll talk quickly through some other types of impairments. So for physical impairments, many users with a physical impairment will only be using a keyboard or an on-screen keyboard. So all controls should be usable with the keyboard. The user should be able to reach all clickable elements, and the order in which they do this should make sense. So things that you want to look at are, can they navigate to the menu? Can they navigate through a form? Can they navigate through a video, just like a normal user would be? Another thing is cognitive impairment and other types of disabilities. So this actually ties in with UX and UI design. And actually having good UX principles are really helpful for accessibility as well. So improving things like readability, writing in plain English, keeping content simple and having unambiguous calls to action. These are all things that would really help people with cognitive impairments. Keep in mind that these things should not detract from the design of your website. On the contrary, all of your users will benefit from an easy to reuse site. So how do we want to do this? So this, if people aren't aware, is kind of a visual representation of writing HTML code. So the most important principle is to use something called Semantic HTML, markup that describes what your content means, not what it looks like. A feature of HTML and CSS is that you can use CSS to make any element look like any other element, but a screen reader wouldn't be able to understand that. Instead, you should use appropriate elements for the task at hand. So if you look at the thing on the right here, this is semantic markup. The header is in a thing that's called header. The article and so on are in their own things that are defined as such. You can create the same looking website using just divs in your HTML, but for a screen reader, they would not be able to understand what the difference between these elements are. So a good example is to show you something from this website. Can people see this still? Yeah, cool. So this website is really cool. It's called a single div. And if you look at all of these rectangles of designs, all of these, the only code that's written for this is a single div element in the HTML. And everything else about its design is actually coded or defined in the CSS. So according to a screen reader, all of these would look the same. I can do a quick little thing that inspects the code for this. So if I go to this one called Zap, you can see that in here, there is no code other than 2 HTML markers to say div. And if you go in here similarly, that's the same. So this is a really cool lesson or insight into CSS design and how powerful it can be. But for accessibility purposes, we don't want to just rely on using CSS to create our websites. Let's see if I can find my cool. So a few other things about HTML and CSS. You want to structure HTML the way that you want it to be read. In principle, you can use CSS to arrange elements however you like, but a screen reader will mostly just run down the HTML as it is written in the code. Similarly, you want to nest your elements into sensible chunks with their own headings. So that's like when we go back to here with the header, article, figure, footer. So a screen reader can jump to these sections without needing to navigate through an entire page. The next set of things is JavaScript. This is commonly used in website design. There's things like jQuery and just normal JavaScript to make your website look nicer and be more interactive and useful. But using JavaScript in the wrong way can also severely harm accessibility. Usually JavaScript can enhance UX as not necessary to cut out completely from your site. You'll make your site less easy to use for many users. For example, here, this is probably quite a familiar form element for people, the ability to drag and drop files into this region of a website and it uploads it for you. This was actually implemented in one of the new BfE forms, I think for chapters or something. And this makes general usability much better because you can just go to a folder and drag instead of trying to navigate to find a file. So you can see that this is an important thing to have. Instead, we need to think about how JavaScript can be written accessibly. So there's some more principles around JavaScript, and here are some good practices when thinking about that. In general, use JavaScript to enhance normal functionality rather than to make large changes or build the entire page structure. For example, using JavaScript to validate a form client-side will help users to fill out the form more easily, but it wouldn't affect non-JavaScript users at all. So here is, so now we need to think about people who do not have access to JavaScript or do not use JavaScript on their websites. And they usually have a good reason to turn it off sometimes. For example, users with old browsers and computers, or slow internet connections, or just strict security restrictions. To make your website accessible to these people, your website should be able to be used without JavaScript, even if the user experience isn't as good. So for example, here, this is the same web element as the last one I showed you with the drag and drop form, but this is what it should look like without the JavaScript turned on or without any JavaScript. You should still be able to upload files. There is a clearly shown button where they can still search for files as usual. And so this form was still entirely usable even without JavaScript. So this, I think, is one pretty important thing for considerations at BfE. We have a lot of people accessing our websites and our content from third world countries where they might have less reliable or slow internet connections. So, if this is a demographic we really care about, making sure our websites are accessible and usable without needing JavaScript is a big factor that we need to think about. Now, finally, I will very quickly touch on mobile web development. So a lot of things about web development and accessibility will apply from desktop to mobile. Like basically all of these things are still going to be useful that I talked about, but there are some additional considerations that hasn't been covered. As you can see from this little infographic here, these elements that look sensible and usable on a big, wide desktop will need to be adapted to a tablet or a mobile, and the order needs to change. So this is called responsive design. If you were to view this website the way that it's formatted on a mobile, everything would be incredibly small and not very readable. So mobile browsing actually makes up about half of all internet traffic. So almost any website you make should be responsive enough to work on a mobile browser. Increasing, furthermore, related with BfE and our mission, increasing access to mobile phones in third world countries also means that making sure BfE sites and resources need to be accessible to arguably the most important portion of the demographic. And web dev comes, mobile dev comes with its own set of accessibility considerations on top of everything I've talked about here. So I won't go into this beyond this at this point, but I think it's something that's also really interesting to look into. So I'll finish off with some resources that you can check out yourself if you're interested. And another thing that you can try after this is to have a more hands-on approach to understanding why accessibility is important. So maybe a thing you should do is try going onto some of your favorite sites, but try only using your keyboard. Try using your favorite sites, but try filling in a form. Try navigating a complex system of menus and sub-menus, for example, like Amazon, and try playing a video. How easy do you find it? Were there some sites that are easier than others? What do you notice that's different about only using a keyboard? Or if you want to be a bit braver, you can also try downloading a screen reader. There's lots of Chrome extensions that do this, and see if you can try accessing a bunch of websites using a screen reader, like someone who is partially sighted or completely blind. As a word of warning, screen readers get incredibly annoying incredibly quickly because they will just read out everything that it sees. Again, from the British Library project, I was working on accessibility, so I had screen reader turned on for several days, and probably drove me and my partner crazy because we were just constantly talking about everything that was on the screen, including any Slack messages that popped up whilst I was doing stuff, which is fun. All right, so that is everything that I wanted to say today. Thanks for coming. And I guess if there's any questions, feel free to ask and I'll try and answer them.
Yeah, Wendi, thank you so much for the presentation. That was really amazing. I noted out a lot of points from myself as well. There were really a lot of things to learn. Yeah, and I think at this point it's good to open up to the floor if we have any questions or anything you want to share. And if not, actually, I have some of things written that I want to talk about as well. So I guess before this talk, before I had the conversation with Wendi about accessibility, my only understanding about accessibility was about color blindness, because I'm personally doing machine learning research, and a lot of things that we got warned about is what are the colors you should use for your plots, and if you're using Python and MATLAB, they are usually standard self colors. Oh yeah, so when they're showing it, so there's the kind of things that a certain combination of colors that you should use on your plot. And we also warned about how you should make sure your plot is clear when it's turned into black and white. But that's really where I stopped. And I think the things that Wendy's showing right now, I'm not even aware of that. So there's a lot of good resources out there currently. And my second thought was that I think this even extends beyond tech and may apply to BfE outreach and communications, because a lot of the social media, I think the social media platforms that we're using right now, LinkedIn or Facebook, when you upload an image, you have a sometimes non-obvious option for you to enter an alt text, which is what Wendi was saying, that things that will be read out if people are using a screen reader, or if people can't see the images. And at least to me personally, when I make BfE Facebook posts, I think I'm always quite negligent on that, or just put in very random stuff. So definitely there's a huge point of consideration. The third thing I wanted to say, it's really a question, but I mean, I guess it's open to floor. I wonder how emojis are being processed by screen readers.
I think there's usually descriptive text accompanying all the emojis. So that's pretty obvious in something like Slack, where a way to print out emojis is like the colon, blah, colon.
Right.
I imagine this is something similar with emojis.
Yeah, I was thinking about it because you know how some emojis are now in like in Unicode, so you can actually just copy and paste the emojis across the text. So, but I mean, I'm sure they handle that. Just something on top of my head. But yeah, that's all the things that I wanted to share. Wonder whether anyone else has something to talk about. But if not, thank you so much, Wendi, for the presentation, and thank you all for attending the session. The recording for this session will be available on BfE's YouTube channel, and yeah, to share it with your friends or whoever you are working in BfE that may find this useful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.